Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healthy Living live stream. I'm your host, Dr. Andy Kaufman. Today, we're going to talk about sweating and how it can be useful for detoxification. But first, let me just put an announcement out there that the membership is open for the True Living Fellowship, which has a lot of content beyond these live streams and explores areas outside of medical science as well. So please take this opportunity to check out the True Living Fellowship and see how it can help you become more sovereign and knowledgeable living in the truth. So let me also draw your attention to live stream number 10, What Makes Toxins Stick Around, where I talked about fat-soluble toxins because that is important material, a prerequisite for today's discussion. So the skin is the largest organ in the body. However, there is a paucity of research into the detailed physiologic mechanisms of the skin. So the area of sweating, which is a function of the skin, there are a lot of gaps in our knowledge about the exact functions. But what we can say is that certainly it's involved in temperature regulation or thermoregulation, because we all know that when we get hot, that we sweat. But there are other things that also make us sweat, possibly, our emotional responses, for example, if we're nervous. And we tend to get sweaty palms and soles of the feet, which have among the highest concentration of sweat glands in our body. And then we also know that our armpits can perspire more in certain emotional or other situations. So there are a variety of mechanisms that lead to sweating. Also, there are chemicals and pharmaceuticals, as well as herbal extracts and various plant materials that can induce sweating and fevers as well. So there are many things that can stimulate sweating. So let's talk a little bit about how it is carried out by the body by looking at this model of the skin anatomy. So here we have the three types of sweat glands in this illustration. The eccrine glands, which are the most predominant. They're approximately between 2 and 4 million on our body, and they're distributed all over the skin, including in the armpits and on the face and forehead, as well as in the genital regions, on the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand. And they're more concentrated in certain areas. And you can see that the eccrine glands on the left have this kind of squiggly, spaghetti-like structure, and then a duct that goes all the way to the skin surface. What's not pictured in here is that there is a blood supply below the eccrine gland, and there's also interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that is outside the cells but in the tissues, that all can get into the sweat gland for secretion of sweat. And then the duct communicates directly with the surface of the skin, so any secretions are going straight out to the skin. And this is in contrast with the apocrine glands, which you'll see right next to that in the middle, because those deliver their secretions directly into the hair follicle. And they come out of the skin through the hair follicle. And they are also mixed with secretions from another type of gland, denoted on this picture, the sebaceous gland. And the secretions of the sebaceous gland, which are important for this discussion, are fatty substances. And this is ascribed to several functions, such as lubricating and protecting the skin from a variety of environmental hazards. And we all know that overproduction of the sebaceous gland leads to oily skin, which may be a cosmetic issue for some of us, but it is useful for those secretions to get out of the body. So the apocrine sweat and the apocrine glands are what are concentrated in your armpits and in your genital region. They're also on your face and forehead to a lesser degree. And these are the type of sweat glands that are associated with the odor of the armpits, and perhaps of the groin as well, where there's a whole industry of hygiene products geared towards overcoming that because it's become socially unacceptable in our modern culture. But this is not true in many other cultures, and something worth considering in this discussion. Now, this illustration denotes a third type of sweat gland, a so-called apoecrine gland, which is a combination of the two. But I don't think this is a very important distinction, because the main difference is the hair follicle and sebaceous gland mixture with the sweat gland versus directly communicating with the skin. But the apoecrine glands tend to be mostly in or exclusively in the armpits. So they're mixed with apocrine glands in that area. Now, one important thing that is not pictured in this illustration is that right on the bottom, because we see the two top or most superficial layers of the skin in this image, the epidermis, where the hairs are coming out, and also the dermis, which is the middle layer. But right below the picture would be the subcutaneous fat layer. And that is where we have the fat cells or adipocytes. And this is why I mentioned what makes toxins stick around, Healthy Living Livestream number 10, because that is where many fat-soluble toxins are stored. And it's in very close proximity to the sweat glands and the sebaceous glands. So there is a possibility, although this has not been directly investigated, that material can get out of the fat cells, perhaps by diffusion or some other mechanism, and get into these glands to be secreted through the skin. Because we do have some data that some of these compounds do get secreted in the sweat and or sebum, but the mechanism is not known. So now that we understand the basic physiology and anatomy of the sweat glands and the function of sweat, let me tell you some of the basic things that are in the secretions. So first of all, the sweat is generally 99% water, and the remaining 1% consists of a variety of different compounds. Now, some of these are electrolytes, as we know. The main one is sodium chloride, and the other trace minerals are present in much, much smaller quantities and include even substances like zinc and potassium. However, the research does not show that excessive sweating leads to deficiencies in these trace minerals, and it has to be quite excessive to cause a significant change in the levels of sodium and chloride. So in other words, sweating is not a major risk for electrolyte disturbances. Now, there are also a variety of metabolic waste products that are found in the sweat, one of the principal ones being urea, which is the way the body gets rid of nitrogenous waste or the breakdown products of proteins. And this is one of the main roles of the kidney. So there is much thought that the sweat glands actually serve as a backup or third kidney through the skin. However, the physiology of the sweat glands with how they remove urea and other substances is not exactly the same as the kidneys. It doesn't have quite as much flexibility in the control mechanisms, but I won't get into any more detail with respect to that. Now, in addition, there are also foreign chemicals that have been found in the sweat, including heavy metals, as well as a variety of synthetic environmental toxins. And I'm going to show you those studies now. So if we can go to the next slide. Now, here is a review article where they scoured the literature looking for evidence of heavy metals being present in sweat. And they analyzed, I think it was 24 studies that met the criteria as being of high enough quality to include in this review article. And I'm going to go through 4 tables that look at 4 different heavy metals. So here, table 1, which had the fewest studies, was on arsenic. But you can see that arsenic is excreted in the sweat, and it may be at comparable, not as high levels necessarily as in the urine, but it certainly is present. Now, if we go to table 2, there's a lot more data looking at cadmium. And you can see here from these studies that cadmium secretion in the sweat is significantly higher than the blood or urine levels when they were compared. And we also can see that there may be some differential detection in healthy versus chronically ill subjects where it was looked at. Now, cadmium wasn't detected in the sweat in every single study, and it seemed to have some geographic relationships. For example, in Australia, there were 2 studies, and one found some low levels of cadmium in the sweat, and the other one found no levels. But if we also look at the blood levels in those studies, we'll see that their difference was also present there. Now, an interesting finding is that there doesn't seem to be a direct correlation between the urine levels of cadmium and the sweat levels, so that there may be very different mechanisms by which cadmium is excreted through the sweat as compared to the urine. Now, if we go to the next table, where is looking at lead specifically, and I apologize if this is really small, but there were quite a number of studies looking at lead in the urine. And what's interesting here is that you can see that the lead in the sweat was considerably higher than the urine in many of these studies, having ratios around up to 16 times as much in the urine. Now, also, if we look in a little more detail, there was an experiment where they acutely gave animals lead acetate and did not see a sort of peak or a change in the sweat concentration over time like they would see in the blood. So, in other words, what may be happening is that the lead is stored in the tissues first and then later gets out into the sweat. Whereas when there's an acute poisoning, you won't see a lot of lead coming out in the sweat, but you will see it in the blood until it gets stored in various tissues in the body. So the studies where people had chronic lead exposure, including workers in a factory that produced lead batteries, you saw very high urine levels, much higher than in the acute lead poisoning experiments. On the next table, they looked at studies assessing mercury in sweat, blood, and urine, or simply in sweat. And once again, you found considerable excretion of mercury in sweat across these studies. So we can see now substantial evidence from quite a number of studies that these heavy metals are present in sweat. Now, there has been some criticism of this research, and it is still a relatively small amount of studies. However, if we look carefully at the collection methods, which has been one of the major criticisms of this research, we can see that there are a variety of different collection mechanisms used, and they all seem to have the same results. And the differences in these collection methods would argue against some of the criticisms as giving false results for these studies. Now, there also is some criticism that some of these compounds that have been shown in the sweat may not come from the eccrine glands or the apocrine glands, but may come from the sebaceous glands. Now, this is certainly possible because, especially for fat-soluble toxins, because the sebaceous glands secrete a very fatty material. And it would be relatively easy to do such a study because you could just measure the sweat coming off the palms or soles of the feet where there are no apocrine glands, and you could compare that with the armpits. Or you can biopsy the sebaceous glands directly and measure those. But this, unfortunately, has not been done so far, although there are biopsy of sebaceous gland studies, but they don't look at environmental toxins. They only look at the compounds that we make in our body. So let's look at another study of not of heavy metals, but here of PBDE, which is a flame retardant chemical. And we can see in table 2 in this study, there are several different varieties of this chemical. And in the third row, that 17 out of 20 of the subjects in this experiment had these compounds in their sweat, and you could see that they were at comparable levels to other body fluids like the blood. Now, these compounds were not excreted in the urine, which is quite interesting. Now, in the bottom table here, table 3, you can see a comparison of the levels of these compounds in both the blood, which is the BL heading, and P, which is perspiration, in healthy subjects versus chronically ill subjects. And we see in the case of each one of these chemicals in the perspiration, substantially higher levels of these chemicals than in the ill patients compared to the healthy patients. So that is some circumstantial evidence pointing to the possibility that these toxins are associated with chronic illness. Of course, we need scientific studies rather than observational studies to confirm that. Now, in the next study, they looked at bisphenol A or BPA, and there was no nice table to display here, but they did give some bullet points of their conclusions. So they did find that BPA is excreted in sweat, and that concentrations in the sweat are higher than the urine. So once again, this points to the fact that there is a different mechanism by which it's secreted in the sweat, and it's not the sort of third kidney function, because otherwise we would hypothesize that the levels would be similar in the urine and sweat. Now, in some of these cases, they couldn't detect any BPA in the blood, but still found it in sweat. And it's important to know that in this study, the collection method did not include any plastic. They used a glass jar and sometimes a stainless steel like spatula to scrape the sweat off the skin, which may also get sebum into the sample, as I discussed that possibility. But there were no plastic compounds, and they pre-washed the skin with a non-toxic soap to make sure to remove any residue that may have been contaminated from another source. So since there's no secretion in the urine, but there is in the sweat, this is consistent with bioaccumulation, that BPA may build up in the body's tissues rather than staying in the blood and being quickly eliminated through the urine or the GI tract. Okay. Now, the next study looks at another plasticizing chemical, phthalates. And once again, not all, but some of the metabolites of the phthalates were found in the sweat as well. And those are highlighted in the table on the left. All right, so I think I've shown enough data here for you to get a sense that there are a variety of toxic compounds that are present in the sweat. And this strongly suggests that the sweat is a natural detoxification mechanism of the body. And I've said many times that whenever anything is coming out of the body, it is a detox mechanism because it's the body getting rid of something undesirable in some way. And I don't think it's just for cooling, because the body always accomplishes multiple tasks to increase its efficiency. So if sweating is a mechanism of detoxification, then how does that relate to the health of our modern society? Because a cultural element has come into existence that sweat and body odor associated with sweat is no longer socially tolerable. And there are all kinds of products and ways that people go about trying to avoid sweating. In fact, I did a little search on the internet just block sweat is the search term I put in, and you had tons and tons of articles come up, a lot of them from beauty magazines, but also even from mainstream news sources, Business Insider, places like that, of how to avoid sweating, how to sweat less, how to block sweat, how to stop sweating, because it is so intolerable within our cultural mores. So as a result of that, there are some chemicals that have come into commercial and cosmetic use that can actually block sweat. And I'm specifically talking about aluminum salts. And if we could bring up the slide here. So this is a typical website, and you could find lots of articles like this. This is from L'Oreal, the cosmetic manufacturer, talking about what are aluminum salts. And the purpose of this webpage is really public relations. It's to assure you that they've been used for a long time and they're perfectly safe and non-toxic. But what actually happens is that there are a variety of different aluminum salts. So that's like an aluminum ion combined with a counter ion. And there are different ones that are used in different products. But what happens is that these salts actually physically plug up the openings of the sweat glands and block the sweat from coming out. And that's how they work. And they're included in many hygiene products, but principally in antiperspirants, but may also be present in lipstick and a variety of other cosmetics. And cosmetics have different strategies to, prevent sweating and running of the actual makeup on the skin. And they use a variety of water repelling substances, which are toxic in and of themselves, that try to impede the sweating. So all of these things can potentially be hazardous to our body's natural mechanisms. And if we look at the last slide, there's actually a study, and this is from 1984, but there's subsequent similar data, and where people who are chronically exposed to aluminum salts to block the sweating, they biopsied their sweat glands and looked at them, and they all showed abnormal degenerative changes. So the authors concluded that long-term exposure to these aluminum salts actually will lead to structural degeneration of important aspects of the eccrine glands. So what can you take away from all this information, and what can you do to improve your health and not block your body's natural detoxification functions? Well, I think first it's important to consider that the cultural aspects about body odor and such are kind of created. They don't occur in nature. Now, of course, we don't want people turning away from us if we smell really, really bad, but we have to think about what's really causing the bad odor. Is it just something that all humans have to go through, or does it indicate a poor state of health and a number of toxins inside of us? And when they sweat out, the resulting set of events that occurs leads to the odor. So what's coming out of us is coming from inside of our body. And if we have lots of toxins inside the body, then our sweat is going to smell much worse, as well as our sebum. So if you really want to tackle this problem from a social point of view, you have to consider improving your health, undergoing a detoxification protocol, cleaning up your lifestyle, etc. And I kind of talked about some of the compounds that come out that may contribute to these bad odors. But what you definitely also don't want to do is to use chemicals on your skin that are going to block this process from happening, because if these toxins stay in your body and can't get out through your sweat, they're going to either be stored in some tissue or organ where they could be more toxic, or they'll get out another way, which may be much less pleasant, like, for example, through a variety of types of skin eruptions, things like eczema. And we see from the data that the function of the sweat glands is impaired in these conditions, just like we saw with chronic exposure to aluminum salt. So be very, very careful about the various cosmetic and hygiene products that you use, and to definitely avoid antiperspirants. On the other side, we can do things to make sure that we sweat on a regular basis. And those of us that get into intense exercise, this is a very positive way to induce sweating. And actually, your body becomes more efficient and sweats sooner and more profusely as you become well conditioned as an athlete, and your body is used to sweating as a mechanism to regulate your body temperature during intense exercise. But there are passive ways to sweat as well. Bundling up with a bunch of clothing while you do some light exercise. Of course, this is the way many wrestlers and other athletes may cut weight for a match. And it's important that you don't overdo it, because the loss of water in your body, you should make up for the loss of water. But perhaps it's not necessary to make up for the loss of salt. Just follow your taste preferences and add salt to your food so that it tastes the way you want, because our body is very good at indicating our salt balance through that mechanism. But also things like saunas, which have become very popular and can be very, very beneficial for health. In fact, I even include them in some of my protocols, especially when addressing heavy metal toxicity. And there are relatively inexpensive saunas that you can buy and keep in your home. And there are many spas and clubs that have access to this. Steam baths or steam showers or steam rooms is another passive option. And whether it's an infrared sauna or a dry sauna, they are both beneficial, but you can certainly do your own research. All right, well, that concludes my presentation for today, talking about sweating, both the natural physiology of it and its role in detoxification and the evidence for that, and a few things you can do to facilitate your body's healing mechanisms.
Very, very well done, Andy. Really enjoyed it. After doing all of your protocols and having followed your dietary recommendations, I have noticed no more. I haven't smelled like trouble, to say the least, after having done all of those things. So I certainly recommend it. And even after hard, intense exercise, it's barely noticeable. Well, it's barely noticeable at that. And so let's go to some questions then. We have Sandy. Since I'm still having trouble with hot flashes, does this count for therapeutic sweating?
Well, yes, of course it does, although it may not be intentional. This is your body actually trying to induce a detox mechanism. When women have an advantage over men in their body's ability to cleanse, because every time they have a menstrual cycle, if they don't get pregnant, right, they expel the uterine lining and the unfertilized egg. But the body takes advantage of that by mobilizing toxins and bringing it to the pelvis so that it can also be excreted with the menstruation. And when that goes away, the body doesn't have another mechanism handy. And it may still, through hormonal fluctuations, try to mobilize those toxins and bring them to the pelvic area, but there's basically gates up saying we're not, we're closed for business. So they can circulate around the blood, and one of the ways for the body to purge them is by generating a fever, essentially, which is what a hot flash is. So it is useful that your body does that. But if you want to help your body not need to do that, you can do other types of cleansing procedures to lower that toxic burden.
All right, excellent. Another question from Salida. Could sweating too much cause a histamine reaction?
Not really sure exactly what you mean by a histamine reaction, but if you mean that could some of the toxins that are coming out through the sweat irritate the skin, that's an interesting possibility. And I think we'd have to observe people further. But it certainly is known that if you sweat a lot but don't rinse it off or bathe, and wear clothing that accumulates a lot of sweat. First of all, just the moisture itself can irritate the skin and cause issues, but perhaps the toxins that are coming out in the sweat also may irritate the skin and cause certain kinds of lesions. I think what you mean by a histamine reaction would be hives, and I'm not aware of excessive sweating leading to hives, although I may just not know.
All right, a question from Mindy. If using a hot tub to sweat, do the benefits of sweating outweigh any negative effects of the chemicals in the water?
Well, I would encourage you to try to bathe with purified water. So if you put chelating substances in the water, for example, they may attract many of the toxins out of the water if you're just bathing with tap water. If you have access to a spring, you certainly could bathe in spring water or go to natural springs for bathing, although this may not be convenient to do on a regular basis. But there are a variety of types of filters. At a minimum, I highly recommend putting a charcoal filter in your bath and shower to at least reduce some of the VOCs and chlorine and other toxins. But certainly it would be better to bathe with clean water.
Right. I mentioned hot flashes, but I think I should balance that out with, let's see, night sweating for men. Question from S. Derry. Please share your thoughts about night sweating in men.
Yeah, I think, night sweating is a symptom of some serious illnesses. I'm not saying that every episode of night sweating is associated with illness, but things like tuberculosis and Hodgkin's lymphoma, night sweating is one of the characteristic symptoms, also heart failure. So this is something definitely to be concerned about. If your body is sweating when at rest, there must be excess toxicity, and that could contribute to the development of disease. So you'd want to encourage more sweating and potentially do additional detox protocols.
Right, last question. Liquid chlorophyll is often recommended for excessive sweating. How or why would this help?
Well, I'm not familiar with this remedy, but if the purpose of it is to decrease sweating, then it's not helping. It's simply turning off a natural body mechanism. You'd have to look first of all, how do you measure if sweating is excessive or normal? That's a challenge unto itself. But if you feel that, your body is sweating excessively, and maybe it's compared to the past for your own body, then there's a reason. There's something it's trying to get rid of. And if you can figure out what that is and help your body eliminate it, then it will no longer need to sweat excessively.
All right. This was an excellent episode, Andy. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to the next one. Do you have any closing remarks before we close off the live stream, Andy?
Well, I definitely enjoyed this topic. It caused me to work up quite a sweat. And so I want to remind everyone that the membership at the True Living Fellowship is open. So please check it out with the links below or on my profile page. And we will see you next week for another Healthy Living live stream.
Goodbye, everybody. See you next time.